Hello, everyone. We're just getting started. A few more people are going to be logging in hopefully shortly. We had 75, 76 total people sign up for today's event. And I am here today to be your MC and hostess with the mostest, right next to Senor Eric Johnson. And I am Lisa Morales-Hellebo, co-founder of REFASHIOND Ventures. My GP partner in crime is Brian Longaway, who you may all know as the tall guy from Ghana that is always sporting our Worldwide Supply Chain Federation t-shirts and orange cap. We have been besties and in the supply chain game since 2016. We have been building REFASHIOND Ventures since, 2019. And we decided to shift it to being a rolling fund on AngelList, which had our first close in July of this year. And we've started deploying checks, yay, in early stage supply chain. In case you can't tell, this is something that we are very passionate about, and we love that our community all embraces our extreme nerdiness on this topic as well. And to invite the rest of you into our world, I would love to pass it over to Eric Johnson to introduce himself, and then we're going to go into the first question that is going to set the stage and have all of our guests introduce themselves with a little context. We have a little amuse-bouche to start the dialogue today.
Cool, thanks Lisa. Really delighted to be joining you today. I'm Eric Johnson, Senior Technology Editor at the Journal of Commerce. We're a B2B publication focused on global logistics and trade. I spend 99.9% of my, working day, total day, thinking about logistics technology and the crazy world that it's become. So I'm really excited to be talking to our panelists today. So I will stop speaking now so that the people you actually tuned in to hear from can have a little bit of context about themselves. So
we have an amazing lineup, and Eric and I thought we were so clever to be able to come up with a question so that instead of just saying, here's my background, this is what I've done, you can give us a little bit of context in the form of your answer. So our opener is, why is your perspective on supply chain what it is? What's your frame of reference from which you approach the topic of supply chains and their futures? And I'm going to start with you, Deborah, because you look like you're chomping at the bit to answer this.
Oh no, my nonverbals are all over the place. That was my, oh gosh, I don't know if I can explain myself to people. So I'll do my best here. My name is Deborah Dole. I'm here representing an organization I lead called the Circular Supply Chain Network. We're a global nonprofit. Nonprofit meaning we literally make no money. We're just a group of supply chain professionals who volunteer together to bring together other supply chain professionals. And we're having a great time doing it. Why I'm pausing is because I love inventory more than any topic in the world. Even more than Excel, which used to be my most exciting topic to get people excited about. And I'm not actually sure why. I suppose we all know those children who separate their blocks into colors and the M&Ms into cupcake tins. I don't know if any of you were like that. I was. So maybe we're inventory people, the people who need to see things flow. But the way that inventory flows through systems to me is far more exciting than the system itself. I'm up for a big debate with any supply chain folks who are like, no, the network is what it's all about. But inventory doesn't lie to us. And I think that puts the science into supply chain, that the way we push on inventory, if we do it the same way twice, it will act the same way. The beauty in supply chain is we can never do it twice because we are living out in the world, in the wild. And it seems like our scenarios and our days are always different. So none of that answered your question, but I have outed my deep desire to talk about inventory all day. So if you give me another open-ended question like this, it will be inventory related again.
Well, I think you did give us why your perspective is the way it is. You know, usually it does tie back to childhood. I myself was obsessed with fashion since I was very young, and specifically how you make things. and the act of creating patterns, choosing your materials, and turning something into nothing, and then finding value in what you create. So that for me is my frame of reference. I love yours. Sorting M&Ms. Peter, I'm going to turn it over to you and ask you the same question. What's your frame of reference and that you approach supply chains and the future?
Well, thanks, Lisa, and a real pleasure to be with you and Deborah and Eric, and Chris, and the others today, and a pleasure to have an opportunity to talk about these topics. I would say that where I come from is I've been a specialized journalist in this market since the early 90s, and I've made it my business to talk to every conceivable type of individual in this space. People on the docks and in centers all the way up to CEOs, across the spectrum of customers and providers. And it's all kind of come together in sort of what my own kind of perspective is, watching the disruption that we're seeing now unfold. And it, as Eric will tell you, because we have spirited debates within our team, I'm a little bit of a technology skeptic, and not an overwhelming skeptic or anything like that, and not no sort of orthodoxy of my views, but I tend to think that when it comes to supply chain, the complexities around the physical movement of goods tend to trump anything that would happen in the technology world, because we haven't yet gotten to the point where we can be like it was in Star Trek, and we can beam the cargo from one place to another. It has to still physically move. Maybe one day that will change. Can't rule out anything these days, can we? And so the realities of the physical movement of goods, to me, are really kind of where the sort of proverbial rubber hits the road. And what makes that happen? Well, as we know from what we're seeing unfold in Los Angeles, Long Beach, ships have to be able to berth. Cargo has to be unloaded. Trucks have to show up. The chassis has to be mounted so that a container can be put on it. And also, relationships have to be in place to make things happen. And so a lot of times in watching all this happen, I sort of revert to what I kind of consider to be the sort of bread and butter of this issue. Meanwhile, keeping an eye on technology and certainly watching how technology is beginning to impact the market.
¿Qué tanto el dirigente tiene control de ese camerino?
Can we put ourselves on mute if you're not? Yeah, great, thanks.
Or maybe I was being heckled.
In Spanish.
That's a possibility.
You don't want to know what they were saying.
Right, if you're going to heckle somebody, you should do it in a language they understand. So, Lisa, I'm saying that was very long-winded, but that's sort of where I'm coming from in this discussion.
Well, I love your perspective as well, because again, I like to correlate things back to the way my brain works, and I love systems, but my thinking and the reason I arrived at this obsession with supply chain at this stage in my career is that localization helps eliminate a lot of the issues. Like, if I keep on thinking of those signs when you're driving by like Boston and it says, if you bought this condo, you'd already be home. And like, if you invested in localization, you wouldn't be stuck in that port. So for me, that is one of the most interesting, exciting opportunities that is really having a spotlight shown on it due to all the brokenness of our current globalized systems. Christopher, you're up, sir. Tell us your context and framework for supply chains and why you approach them the way you do. I mean, I loved your creating the USB protagonist in your book, and I'm really curious to hear what made you choose that. Or maybe I'm jumping ahead because I'm only on chapter 7.
So, as a technology journalist at the Wall Street Journal, my context, my starting point was technology. That was really how I came into writing a book about it, which came out last week. So it's still pretty current for those who are interested, although it's shocking how much has changed between when I finished the book in spring and now. But at the end of the day, technology, when you say you write about technology, or what you're really talking about is change, right? Because technology is just the tools that humans use. Sometimes it's also the systems by which we organize ourselves and labor. So, Peter, I agree with you that ultimately supply chain is this incredibly labor intensive industry. And I'm always skeptical when people say, oh, we're going to automate X, Y, or Z. But the way that technology is getting incorporated does mean a lot of change now and in the future. And so that's my framework. I want to sort of chart that out.
Fantastic. Eric, I'm going to pass it over to you now. I get to sit back and drink my coffee.
Yeah. So we're going to go one more time around the horn with a sort of related question that I don't ever see anyone ask. And so we have this esteemed panel who thinks about this stuff really intently. And I always am curious, Lisa asked what drew you to this industry or what your framework was. I'm going to ask, how does the industry that you look at or are trying to impact, how do they benefit from your involvement? And maybe we'll go the other way this time. So Christopher, if you want to take the first crack. I assume when you write a book, you're hoping to educate people about something or other. How do you see your interest in this space providing value to the industry or the broader populace?
Yeah, so my book, was pitched and is a book length explainer. So I was really inspired by things like, John McPhee's collection of essays, Uncommon Carriers. I just feel like, for those of you like the people present here who are really immersed in supply chain, it's the water you swim in. For those who are outside of it, I mean, even people who are pretty well educated and, widely read, it's a mystery. It's just terra incognita. And I wanted to make it accessible to people, to everyone, because I think that understanding it and appreciating that everything that we buy comes from somewhere, was made by someone else's hands, is really kind of essential to being a global citizen. If I can, get that kind of blue sky for a moment, everything from trade wars to actual shooting wars all kind of hinges on where stuff comes from and how it gets to us. And I think we're seeing that now because a system that we normally take for granted is having all these bottlenecks. So suddenly people are paying attention to something that otherwise I think would just be as invisible as, the sewer system or something no less essential, right? Sanitation, the big unmentionable, is the linchpin of civilization and so are supply chain. So I want people to understand that. I want everyone to understand that.
Yeah, really interesting. Lisa and Brian and I were talking before everyone started arriving about sort of the mainstream fascination with supply chain right now. And my maybe counter or contrarian view is that the general populace is not as interested as us online folks like to think that they are, even to this day, where they're actually seeing empty shelves and signs saying out of this product. And I think you're right. I think it's, everyone who's sort of been dragged into this industry or has gravitated toward it has had that moment where the light kind of, flickered on and you're like, oh, wow, this is, you connect the dots. This is how everything gets into my house. But for the vast majority of people, even today, that light has not yet completely flickered. And maybe there's a little bit of interest in it, but there's the same interest that, I had in subprime mortgages in 2009, right? And now I could not explain them to you at all 10 years later, right? So I am interested to see whether this time is different on a long-term basis. But Peter, what do you, when you set out to do what you do, what do you think what benefit are you bringing to the industry?
Well, I don't know, to be honest. I mean, if you, I sort of just feel that if you talk to the right people, the right relationships with sources, that they'll trust you and they'll tell you what's really happening. And if you have enough context bring to the process of reporting, connect the dots in a way to tell somebody something that might be illuminating to them and or interesting and different from what they might read elsewhere, that hopefully they'll benefit from that. And the only I never take that for granted. I think journalists sort of are naturally somewhat humble, or at least I am, and therefore you can only look at the objective measurements of impact. Or people, if you go to a conference, people might tell you, thank you or appreciate you wrote an article that found really interesting. Or a lot of things we look at is we look at our renewal rates, because for a Journal of Commerce subscription you have to pay for that. It's not free, and therefore we can measure. There's a lot of measurements associated with people buying new subscriptions. Well, that's okay, because you can sell new subscriptions, but are they renewing? That's really interesting, because that means that they are finding value in what you're writing. And if you put on a conference, do they come to your conference? What kind of speakers can you get to your conference? So I think that if you just kind of go about doing the sort of bread and butter of what you set out to do, which is, create content, starting with written content that is, where you are trying to do the right thing by your reader, which is write something original, write something meaningful, clearly written, have it be not overly verbose so that you're wasting somebody's time, and have relevant information and background and data included in it. Well, hopefully you're doing something of interest to somebody. But then if you hold yourself to the standard that actually, if you want access to this, you have to pay for it, then you can really tell whether you are making an impact. It's a nice feeling, to be honest with you, Eric, as we have found going through our work over the past year and a half, that it turns out that there is we knew it before, but I mean, we're being reminded of it for sure, that there is a receptive market for high quality content. And Chris, I think you guys find that at the Wall Street Journal too. There's a very strong, editorial culture at the Wall Street Journal around excellence in editorial, just like we have at the Journal of Commerce. And, hopefully that pays off for people.
Deborah, what do you think you're going to
start this with a challenge, Eric?
Okay.
You said that the normal person isn't actually, what do you say, mainstream fascination isn't what we think it is. I disagree. I think if you're in supply chain, there's a moment sometime in the last 18 months that your family or a friend called you and they said, you're on the news. Is this what you do? Did they understand it? No, but at least they've connected to something that they're hearing about. Like, did you put that boat in the Suez Canal? No, it wasn't me actually. But they're starting to actually talk about it, where before I think there was just, it's like what Chris said, it's like going to flip on your light switch and assuming the lights will come on, going to the store and assuming what you need will be there and in every color and every size you could imagine. So while I don't think that there's a complete understanding of the profession, at least we're being talked about a little bit more. So answering your actual question, through my career, I actually started as a supply chain practitioner, and I've used supply chain to explore different industries. I started out at Microsoft with the Surface launch and expanding the retail stores that are now all closed, but a very interesting time in consumer electronics and the quality of manufacturing. I spent some time at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and then I went on to General Electric. And what's interesting about this journey is I have always aspired to explain complicated items as simply as I can. So I like what both Peter and Chris talked about for accessibility and easy to understand language. But I think sometimes in supply chain, we get in our own way. And we want to sound good in front of an executive or sound great in a report. But in reality, it just brings more glazed eyes. And so the more that we can help to explain why something isn't on a shelf, or why ports are congested, or why we may actually need to fundamentally rethink the supply chains that have done so well by us these last few decades. I think it's really up to us to be as simple and approachable as possible. And that's really the value that I bring.
I don't disagree with that at all. And I would say what you just mentioned, I think is very interesting, because one thing that is undeniable is maybe we can disagree a little bit on the wider culture's fascination with it, or the level of fascination, depth of it. But one thing that is incontrovertible is that's the right word, right? I usually have
Sounds good.
when I type, I usually have spell check. So is that CEOs and people at an executive level who used to give a passing fancy to supply chain until something went wrong are now getting weekly, if not daily, updates from their logistics teams, their supply chain officer. They are having direct phone calls with ocean container lines, global freight forwarders, terminals at the ports, trucking companies. They are more involved than ever. So that, I think, is actually a more impactful thing to our world than my aunt in Chicago asking me about a ship on the other side of the world, right? You know, I mean, that is the definition of a passing fancy, right? So very interesting. But and I agree with you on that last bit. Lisa.
I have something to add to that. So my personal objective with my passion for supply chain and talking about it relentlessly is frankly to shock people awake to the impact of their choices that we as consumers have. We have basically forgotten that our choices are driving business, and that because of our infinite optionality and desire for convenience in the first world, we're basically kind of the assholes. We're killing the rest of the planet for everyone else. And if you travel and you go to other countries and you're still seeing the local farmers market and you get to know the local people that are bringing you your produce, it's an entirely different type of experience and connectivity to where your food comes from, where your textiles come from, where your where everything comes from. So I think that we in the first world, in the United States in particular, have entirely lost touch with understanding not only our place in the greater context of the planet, but how our choices of infinite optionality. What do you mean my convenience is not helpful to the world at large? Well, you're the only ones in the world that can rely on 2-hour delivery windows for a slice of cake. Like, what? Do we really need that? I think we've gone so far in one direction that we need to course correct and we need to shock people. We don't have time to just continue with status quo. And I'm grateful personally for what COVID has done for supply chain, in that it did create that sort of shock to the system.
And before we get into some questions and not make this all about our conversation, I thought one really poignant image recently was someone put their local grocery store shelf on the cereal aisle, and they showed all the empty spots on the shelf of some cereal that had not been delivered, but then they panned out and there were still like 84 different choices of cereal. And it's like, that was sort of my moment of like, I got electroshocked. I was like, yeah, there's a balance between the convenience and the options that we have versus, are we really struggling right now? Or are we struggling relative to what we had become accustomed to a few years ago? So, and I know this is like a big part of your book, Chris. So, but yeah, sorry, back over to you, Lisa.
Oh, that's all I wanted to interject. I think we can dive into the next set of questions.
Cool.
This one, I'm going to actually jump down to a question for Chris, because I've been digging into your book and listened to it all the way in to the city today. What drives a business and technology journalist at the Wall Street Journal to invest the time researching and writing a book about supply chains? Your book, Arriving Today, From Factory to Front Door, Why Everything Has Changed About How and What We Buy. It's absolutely a prescient topic, and I'm really curious how you went from Wall Street Journal writer to, hey, this is a subject I think I want to write a book about. and make it really appeal to the masses by really making it relatable.
And Chris, I'm going to add on to that question and ask, was there, I'm going to ask you a more specific thing. Was there one single moment where you knew you wanted to write this, or was it sort of an agglomeration of things that you had been encountering? Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, it took time. The genesis moment was I was standing in an Ocado warehouse, and for those who aren't familiar, Ocado is a grocery e-commerce company. It's as common as anything in the UK. People there take it for granted and seem to think it a little bit middlebrow. And they also have, I think, a $20 billion deal with Kroger in the US to bring their technology here. And what they have pioneered in a way that few others have, I think even Amazon included, is fully automated warehouses. So you walk into an Ocado facility and is nothing but a sea of robots skating over a vast field of towers filled with bins, kind of lowering these long arms, pulling things up. It's all software, it's all algorithms, it's all incredibly optimized. There are 4 human beings in there total. And then the goods, of course, are then sent on conveyors to human beings who pack the groceries, which then get delivered. And that is very labor intensive. But seeing how it happened, listening to the CTO of Ocado talk about it, I was just utterly blown away that it was the most automated system at scale I'd ever seen in my life, including in manufacturing facilities, which tend to be pretty conservative in their adoption of automation, our sort of popular myths notwithstanding. And I just thought, this is unbelievable. Like, this is going to be a sea change. It's already a sea change in how we consume. It's easy to forget that before the pandemic, the penetration of e-commerce was, 50% less than it is now. And I just thought, so few people have seen this. Nobody is talking about this. I need to go write about this. And then I had an agent who said, well, can you think a little bit bigger? What if you looked at changes across the entire supply chain? And then I said, oh yeah, that's a good idea. So that really was the genesis, was being fascinated by this new technology, the potential pace of change, and then sort of backing into how does the rest of the supply chain work. And, frankly, what I discovered was, yes, it's incredibly labor intensive, but it is incredibly dependent on technology and is changing way faster than I think people appreciate, because so much of the technology involved is information technology and has to do with the way that people communicate, organize themselves, the way labor is organized. So there may be, millions of truckers in America, but as I discovered, the way they're doing their job is significantly different than it was even 2 years ago. And that pace of change is continuing, and it's across every component of the supply chain.
Yeah, really interesting.
Chris, can I just, I don't want to challenge you, but I just want to raise a point, which is, did you notice in your research that the pace of technological change along the supply chain can be somewhat uneven? That the distribution center that you described is the extreme end of automation. I mean, that's as far as probably the most automated distribution center possibly anywhere in the world is what you saw in the UK, and bringing that technology here. But then you mentioned trucks. We're still probably a long way off from automated trucks. If you go to are not only have very little automation, the port equivalent of what you just described at the distribution center, but not only that, but the labor unions are digging in their heels and will actively seek to prevent further automation of port facilities. And of course, right now, the most glaring example of supply chain breakdown anywhere in the world is off of ports like Los Angeles, where as of yesterday, there were literally 70 ships off the ports. That's a number we've never even seen anything close to that.
Yeah, Peter, that's everything you said is absolutely true. I think that there is a great deal of change, but like you said, it's very unequally distributed, and the rate of what economists call the installation phase of the technology, which is after the technology has been more or less perfected, and then it has to kind of diffuse and get adopted. That rate, not only does it vary, but like you said, it can be really slow. I mean, reaching back to manufacturing, which is where supply chains start, it's always amazed me how conservative manufacturing is in general, and it's because of all of the economic requirements and the requirements that everything be exactly the same when you're in a mass production facility. So you don't want to change too much too quickly. Everybody has what in the fields that I usually cover is known as technical debt, which means just all of this infrastructure, machinery, ports, etc., that you can't just rip out and change overnight. And like you said too, when you have a unionized workforce, as you do, especially at the Port of LA, Long Beach, that means that every time you want to make a change, there's a big negotiation. I mean, we saw that, right? When the last time there was a contract renegotiation, and protests had just subsided when I was last at the Port of LA. So yeah, increasing efficiency there, it's going to require some amount of technology. I don't think that labor unions are always an impediment to that, because for instance, UPS I think is a great example of an extremely efficient organization, at least in the granularity that I saw on the day-to-day, where their unionized workforce is sort of integral to making that efficiency sustainable day after day after day. So you're right, though. Things are changing in some ways very quickly, but also, and for most people, hardly at all, and certainly not fast enough to keep up.
I want to add on to that, and this is actually a question for Deborah, or dovetailing into circularity. From my perspective, I've literally been featured in a book called Disruptors. So I love disruption, and disruption usually comes from outside industries. So if the industry isn't willing to move quickly enough, then they're going to be primed to be disrupted. And that's a great thing. So, if you're not going to innovate, maybe you shouldn't exist anymore as a company. And a new company will come in and replace you. That is more efficient. That is reusing and repurposing waste and creating new types of jobs that maybe didn't exist before. And so with that, I'll pass it over to Deborah to talk about your perspective on this.
Yeah, thank you. The name of this session today is Supply Chain Future. And I think we can all acknowledge that supply chains are maturing at different pieces, and I think they will forever. And yet we are moving in a direction that we haven't seen before. And I think we're doing it quicker than any of us really are comfortable with. And we're doing it for a couple of reasons. One, technology pace is happening and there's disruption happening. Yes, Ocado came in disrupting brick and mortar grocery. I lived in London. I used Ocado. I could order until 11 p.m. and get something delivered in a 20-minute window the next morning. That's not something that we can do in the States. I was based in Seattle for a long time, so I got all of the Amazon firsts, and that's still not the level of delivery, with some exceptions. Nobody get mad at me. You can get, Amazon now. At the same time, the planet is running out of materials. It's not something we like to talk about, and it's sort of shocking to people, and they can argue, what do you mean by mineability? There's 50 years or less of mineable gold left in the planet. Skeptics will come and say, okay, but we'll come up with a better way to mine. It's not the point. The point isn't how much faster can our ports be. The point is, do we need the port to begin with? Why do we need 70 ships sitting outside the Port of LA? Because we've put ourselves in a position of a very, very, very long supply chain. That's not required anymore. We have different ways of specializing. We have different ways of costing labor, that we can actually produce items in more locations than we have traditionally. The way that we've gotten to where we are today has pulled billions out of poverty, and I don't mean to criticize the up until this point way of working. However, we are sitting at a tipping point now where we simply cannot continue the way we are today, even if we had lots and lots of materials inside the planet. Our world is warming. And again, if you want to be skeptical, fine, but name somebody in your family who hasn't been directly impacted in the last 4 or 5 months from extreme weather. Many folks inside the United States along the East Coast and the South. have been rained very heavily upon, and along the rest of the country has been on fire. So we see these changes happening. And I think given that supply chain makes up 90% of any organization's carbon emissions, it's up to us to start to figure out how we can change the structure of our supply chains. And instead of just making them faster as they are today, we will have to actually fundamentally change how this works. And this is one topic I actually get a little chuckle out of, because typically those on the more conservative end of politics want to reshore to bring back our jobs that were stolen from us, et cetera. Those on the more liberal side of thinking say we need to shorten our supply chains so we have less carbon. The good news is the end is the same, regardless of how you get there. So here's one way that we can actually agree on an end point, which is some version of reshoring. Smaller lot sizes that are in our future. We're seeing sort of build on demand with the technology improvements in what might be called 3D printing, additive manufacturing. It's not for everything, but it is for a lot. And as we start to change out the materials we use to produce, we start to see some pretty fantastic directions for what we call consumption today, which we'll call use in the future. So I just introduced maybe a dozen topics there, Lisa and Eric, for you to pick from for the next question. But a change is coming. And I think it's a massive disservice to our entire profession for us to say, we're just going to go faster and be more automated.
Let me jump in, because I think you hit on a bunch of different things that I tend to tie back, that I think about a lot, and that I try to tie back to my day-to-day reporting, and would love to get all of your opinions on. So while I think we're hearing this directly from major organizations, multinational organizations that are the companies that are moving all of these goods across oceans, that they are under more pressure, sometimes from investors, sometimes they just actually, hopefully they legitimately want to be better in the future, that, you know, this is now a part of their decision making. It's not a vanity type of metric, it's an actual thing. On the other hand, because of the internet and because of technology, we have the ability to buy small lots from China, from Europe, from anywhere, and ship them by parcel, have them aggregated into the traditional means of moving freight like we've never have before. So there's been a huge amount of increase in smaller shipments that normally would not have moved, you know, across continents, right? So, and for me, and I would love to get your thoughts on this, for me, as I've looked at this, you know, sort of the core drivers, it's been that the ability to take an order that the internet has enabled has jumped so far out in front of the ability of the supply chain to fulfill that order, all the steps along that, right? And the ability of some companies to get really good at that has left other ones way behind. And there's this weird, messy, chaotic race. And that Chris, I've not yet read your book, but I would imagine this is sort of the crux of what you're describing. So I don't have any answers. I'm just, these are the things that I'm thinking about is, yes, everybody is sort of very hyper alert, and the things that we're seeing environmentally are I think changing decision-making at a very high level, but we have all these other drivers where the horse is sort of out of the barn. And you can't tell an individual seller in a foreign country that is now all of a sudden getting a bunch of orders through some platform to say, well, that's not the most environmentally friendly way to do business, right? How do you sort of manage that?
But you can. And that's the other half of the title of this session, is the role of corporations and governments. We absolutely can do that. And if we look at what France is doing with short plane rides, they're making them illegal and forcing you to take a train now. I think the only way we can prevent what I'll say, I won't call it silly maybe, but irresponsible supply chain, is using the role of government. There's not a way that competition will force us into being better planet citizens. That is a role I think reserved very specifically for government and for regulators. But I will remind us that the internet is still a disruptive technology. Like, this is a really new platform and a new technology for us. And I think we don't quite know what to do with it. And as we continue to have different versions of the internet now in introducing 5G, we're starting to realize that much of our supply chains are actually becoming obsolete as they rest on old types of technologies. The version 0 of the Ocado example from Chris really relied on RFID and older technologies, which are now going to quickly become obsolete as we start to rededicate these pieces of our technology stack to newer types of technologies. And so the disruption that is disrupting itself, I think, is quite interesting. But that one piece on we can do it, and if we can do it, we'll find a way to do it, because I think people are very clever. Supply chains will do it if they're built to do it, but the regulation role, as boring sometimes as it sounds, I think is the key way to disrupt what will just become a bigger snowball. And at some point we have to sort of interrupt that flow. But I'm curious, Peter, with your skepticism of technology, and Chris, with what you were able to discover as someone who doesn't already love the field of supply chain, I'm keen to hear what you think about this.
I mean, a lot of what you're talking about, the environmental issues, they're tremendous. And, one reason I was excited to be on this panel is that you're the kind of person that I want to learn from, because I think that, I wrote this giant 300-page book with close to 300 references in the endnotes. And that was what it took just to describe the journey of one object and the origins of the technologies involved and how they shape the lives of the people involved. And I did not even, all the environmental impacts were then beyond the scope of my sort of initial foray, but it's something I'm hyper aware of. It's kind of where I want to turn my focus next. I think that, Eric, also, as you outlined, there are these challenges with the convenience that we demand now and are being offered is often inimical to, the best environmental outcome in terms of energy expended or carbon or resources or recycling or any of that. I am hopeful that we are creating these very sophisticated systems that will make, transforming what are really these one-way pipes right now into, truly circular flows of material that are kind of the most energy efficient that we can make them. I think a lot of that, I would recommend everybody listening to this call go watch the Attenborough documentary on Netflix on planetary boundaries. It's his most recent one. It's the most succinct introduction to this topic that you could possibly ask for. Also the most terrifying. It will change you if you watch it. And after watching it, you think like, well, we have like three options here. Like either we radically reduce the human population on Earth, or we all like move to the asteroid belt, or we find radical ways to make our way of life more sustainable. So as resources do become more scarce, economics kicks in. This is what, we're seeing it now, right? So many of the bottlenecks that I traced in the book and I'm working on now as a reporter, it's amazing how many of them have to do with COVID. It's amazing how many of them have to do with shutdowns due to climate change and damaged infrastructure due to extreme weather. So all of these things really have teeth now and are starting to bite. And you see people going to literally the ends of the earth. Let's go mine the bottom of the ocean because we're running out of some of these metals, surface deposits of them. Technology keeps getting better. Fracking really made a fool out of everybody who said we were going to reach peak oil anytime soon. We can keep extracting, but there are all kinds of boundaries on what we can do. And sometimes we just don't know what they are, right? Because our technology shoots ahead and makes certain things more available. And then meanwhile, we don't even realize what other things we're running out of, what so-called, ecosystem services we were taking for granted that we're suddenly deprived of. And now we have to build huge infrastructure to, continue to provide, whether that's not seeing our cities inundated or, having sufficient access to key minerals to build all these electric cars that we need to build. So, economics does play a role whether or not we regulate these things. And I think that we're going to see more and more of that. And that's another way that I think supply chain becomes this really important topic, because right now, if it's the primary driver of inflation and inflation becomes the dominant economic force of the next 10 years, then wow, we all had front row seats for better and for worse. And, it's important to talk about how that's a driver.
Just to jump in, so I think the most important point you made, Deborah, is that government has to be the leader here, because it's not happening on its own. To be honest with you, if you look at what's happening on its own, you will see minimal nearshoring, virtually no nearshoring that's of any sizable amount on it, left the market doing what it's going to do. Just to take that one example, I mean, if you look at, we took a look at containerized imports, so loaded containers coming into the U.S. over the last 10 years, and just kind of asked the question, well, where are they coming from? And is there any indication of any sort of nearshoring that could be spotted in that data? So for example, if there was going to be more nearshoring, you might see greater growth from the Caribbean or from Central America or from South America, even, sort of Asia produced goods kind of moving closer to origin points that would be closer to the US. That's what we were looking at. We were looking at US containerized imports. The fact is, it's not there. The Asia as a percent of containerized imports has gone up over the last 10 years. China itself has kind of gone down a little bit, but the only reason why that is because manufacturing has shifted from China in certain commodities to Vietnam or Malaysia, Indonesia, that kind of thing. But in the aggregate, there's nothing discernible in that data that would indicate that nearshoring is occurring. Similarly, in the whole effort to decarbonize shipping, left to its own, the conversation is now that great, you can experiment with green hydrogen, you can experiment with ammonia, you can experiment with biofuels. Go ahead, sort of try it to your heart's content. You can declare as a company that we will be carbon neutral by 2050. MSC just declared that the other day. Maersk had already declared it, I think about a year ago. Aspirationally, very ambitious, very bold. I don't think that there's a person in shipping who would tell you that if it's not for some kind of global regime of some kind that really gets the industry to where it needs to be, that it's going to be possible. It can't happen on its own. For example, there's the idea that R&D can really reach a stage of traction and maturity and effectiveness on its own. That has been challenged in the concept of a proposed $5 billion R&D fund that is now being considered at the International Maritime Organization. The idea being that wow, I mean, there's tons of innovation, there's tons of ideas, there's a lot of smart people out there, but it's gonna take some real heavy lifting that's gonna go well above and beyond what the market is gonna be able to do on its own in order to make any of these things happen. So I think that's kind of where the focus is. And you look at, like, just at one other point, you look at an Amazon. Okay, I mean, I was having a conversation with somebody the other day. We were sort of debating about what Amazon's strategy is and what they're trying to do. Well, my own observation about Amazon is that they're trying to do whatever they can to narrow the amount of time between when you order something and when you receive it. This massive, unprecedented buildup of distribution center capacity around the country, the creation of its own airline, the employment of hundreds of thousands of small vehicles, independent drivers, anything possible to actually encourage and enable basically what Deborah, you very well say, a lot of that is irresponsible spending. And so, I think that we need, and which is, sort of encouraging to see when governments make big steps and when they are really willing to put political capital on the line in order to make things happen. That's sort of, I'm increasingly feeling that that's really where things are going to happen myself.
I have some thoughts on that. So from what I've seen working in the fashion supply chain and really focused on the paradigm shift to demand chains, localized US-based demand chains tied into circular textile infrastructure, the shift is not coming from the industry. It's not even coming primarily from government regulations in companies overseas. It's really been almost 36 years that the fashion industry has been talking about sustainability, yada, 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 lots of talk, no movement. And they've put millions, if not billions, into greenwashing initiatives and these global pledges and these funds to talk about quantifying things. There is such inertia that they are not going to save themselves, which is why I personally am hopeful for disruption leading the way, because until there is a better mousetrap, a more efficient way that is sustainable inherently, the purpose is not sustainability, but it is a byproduct of the new system that is inherently more efficient, perhaps because you're using your waste materials over and over again and you don't have the need for global logistics and compliance and tariffs and shipping and containers that go from $1,000 one year to $40,000 the next year, and having no idea of when things will actually land. All of a sudden your localized demand chains are looking way more affordable, and the unit economics will always win. If you have a better margin, you will drive the market to adopt. And so that's what I'm hopeful for, and one of the things I've been focused on for 7 years.
Let me ask a question then, and related to what you just said, Lisa. If a year that produces whatever type of, depending on the type of shipper you are, whether it might be a doubling or a quintupling of your ocean freight rates, and the COVID kind of induced kinks, all the other kinks that have been produced over the past year and a half, if those and the tariffs on goods from China, if that doesn't induce wholesale change in their supply chain structure, so if we don't see that over the next year to 2 years, what could possibly be the shock that induces that? What is the disruption that induces that more than what has happened over the last year?
Something better replacing them. So having this infrastructure built up in the new market and not having access to it. All of a sudden having a sort of coalition with shared resources and assets that is truly a shared stakeholder value chain that you need to become a part of to be able to have access to get the cost savings, the better margins, the guaranteed quick turnaround, the customization, personalization, all the things that if you rely on your globalized systems, you're currently like, I don't know when it'll get it, And I've actually spoken to a lot of large fashion holding companies about just this thing. And frankly, the way we're thinking of the systems is to start with constraints. And so one of the constraints that we're focused on is what textiles can be milled from fiber and spun into textiles within the contiguous Americas. So instead of relying on globalized air and ocean freight, we're looking at trucking. And we're looking at, even more hyper-localized, regionalized textile resources. And then what are the constraints for the types of resources that actually can be circularly regenerated? Because we're sitting on generations worth of fibers. We literally don't need to grow another damn thing. And if we truly were to invest in and adopt these new systems, there's a company that, an early stage company I just talked to last week, who is taking the concept of textile post-consumer waste, and right now, instead of having to reclaim it, sort it, disassemble it, sort it again, take off the zippers and the buttons and then resort and shipping it off to different locations based on fiber type for processing, They're focused on, well, what would happen if we just threw all this post-consumer waste into a giant blender and then used chemistry to separate all of the materials and properties? You know, that's the type of thinking that is going to disrupt your globalized systems, because all of a sudden your cotton farmers that are being exploited on the other side of the world, yes, we don't need to be buying from them anymore. And I was actually on a panel last week talking about this, where this woman was like, oh my God, we're going to disrupt all these cotton farmers. Well, they're currently being exploited. Maybe they can farm something that is higher yield and profits for them locally within their local community, contributing greater to their sustainable local economy. So you cannot look at systems as individual components or nodes. You have to look at it as an end-to-end system and understand the ripple effect of all the impacts. And if you're going to disrupt it, what do you replace it with? How are you bettering people's lives, and what are the opportunities created, rather than just what's being eliminated? And I think, Christopher, you were doing that beautifully, at least in the chapters I was reading, where you're talking about upskilling and reskilling and how it creates higher paying jobs. And what I think is really interesting is this space where in the United States, we've had apparel manufacturing here. You know, we used to produce 98% of our own clothing in this country some 50, 70 years ago. And we stopped when we did the great outsourcing. So we have an opportunity to claw back and enable this entirely new workforce, but we don't have to replicate the workforce as it exists overseas currently, where everyone assumes it's low skilled, low wages, exploitative, and extractive. There are new opportunities for reskilling and upskilling, where our local workers can be working with systems, AI, hardware, cyber physical systems, where they're learning how to manage these end-to-end machines or processes, and they can be reskilled and upskilled into six-figure salaries that are like being a lab technician if you're in healthcare. You know, you don't need, although with these, you don't need a college degree. You literally can take a course. Another company I love is called Shimmy. This brilliant woman has gamified reskilling and upskilling garment workers. She works with women in Bangladesh that have a fourth grade education, don't read, don't write, and are afraid to touch computers because they're worth more in their society than their own lives in the caste system. And so within as little as 4 hours, she gets these women to learn how to create digital patterns. I mean, if we can do that in Bangladesh, imagine what we could do here in the States for unemployed people or people wanting to learn new skills and trades. And here, that is a highly sought after career that would have a high salary.
And Lisa, just to interject, I think that reskilling and upskilling does happen. Obviously, this is, one of the things that has sort of, people think, oh, we're seeing greater economic inequality in the United States, but they forget that we're seeing reduced economic inequality across the entire world, right? Somewhere between 1 and 2 billion people have been lifted out of poverty in the past 20 years and are now part of the global middle class. But to be absolutely clear, in the United States, you see a polarization of wages. So yes, more people are making more money. More people are also making less money, and their jobs have been de-skilled. And I think it's really important not to forget that technology has been a downward force on wages in the context of our existing labor laws. It's this deeply unsexy topic that people don't talk about nearly enough. But, if you look at, the $15 an hour jobs that Jeff Bezos wants everybody to get so excited about, that's less than market rate in most of the places for comparable warehousing jobs where those jobs happen. Those are also jobs that are not very physically sustainable for most people. So there's high turnover, which is also a feature, not a bug, because it keeps people from organizing. So it's, I think, important to remember that the United States used to employ a great many more people in manufacturing. Those were high skill, high wage, union jobs. They're gone. We now employ a great many more people in white collar jobs, but we employ also a great many more people, in these de-skilled jobs, whether it's call centers, whether it's fast food, whether it's logistics. And that's why you see a polarization, an increase in economic inequality in the United States, even if you see a decrease in economic inequality between countries and across the entire world. So I think, it's always important to remember that technology is neither a force for good or for ill, it is the context in which we deploy it. Because we could use it to create 1984 if we wanted to. Everybody forgets that George Orwell's book was fundamentally about what would happen when surveillance and computers became widespread, but were only in the hands of the state. Or it could be something more utopian. So I'm always glad to talk to entrepreneurs who are excited about making the world better. But I also think that in aggregate, if you want to make the world better, you need better policy, because from the perspective of, I think, a lot of American workers, we've had pretty detrimental policy in terms of their wages and their benefits and their job security over the past 50 years. So, nowhere have I seen that kind of more in evidence than in logistics, because it is sucking up all of the folks who used to have middle-class jobs in other things that got disrupted by other industries. And so that's part of the reason that I'm so interested in it. I mean, let's not forget that Amazon is on a path to be the largest employer in America, right? It's going to be the new Walmart, and what they decide to do with their labor policies is going to set the tone for everybody.
Peter, what do we think about the sort of global logistics / shipping industries cognizance, strategy around what we've talked about? Like, is there do we think that they are aware of it, but don't think it's unlikely that there's going to be some major sort of consumer shift? Are they taking steps to sort of adapt to a future where there's less volume? I mean, it's funny to say this right now when we're sitting at historic volume levels, right, of trade, but are these discussions that carriers are having and global 3PLs are having?
I don't believe they are to any, and I'm not trying to be disparaging of the topic, because it's incredibly important. But Soren Sko, the CEO of Maersk, was asked about reshoring in, I believe, the last Maersk earnings call, and he said that he's not seeing it, and he doesn't anticipate it. Now, that's an important statement because he's saying that to investors, and whatever you say to investors, they're going to hold you to, and so I don't I don't think there's, I think it's early stage. It's not getting talked about enough. We have a relationship with the Global Association of Port Authorities that where we organized a conference with them. They're called the IAPH, the International Association of Ports and Harbors, and they did a session on the circular economy and how ports could be involved in that. And that was based on some pilot projects that are taking place at the port, I believe the ports of Rotterdam and Antwerp, which are the most sort of progressive, innovative seaports in the world. But that would be my answer, Eric. I mean, there's so much. I mean, all these companies right now are completely focused on serving their customers and helping their customers overcome the disruption that's being seen in the market. But that's disruption that's associated with long haul supply chains.
And not to say that clearly that ocean carriers especially do not make mistakes in terms of strategic mistakes. Like, they have made their mistakes over the last 15 years. They're in a great place right now, but I think they are, in a sense, sort of canary in the coal mine in terms of if they are, building and investing in ways that suggest that they see trade as it exists today perpetuating for a decent amount of time going forward. That's maybe to suggest that the things, I think we're all in agreement about, Deborah, about the future that you laid out, right? Like, that's some of that, if not all of that, needs to take place to some extent. But just in terms of being pragmatic about things, is like the people who are investing huge sums of money or placing bets essentially of huge amounts, that the trade, the structure of trade is going to remain, relatively the same over the next decade. So how do we change that? I guess we talked about policy, but is that enough? Like, I mean, carriers are regulated right now, but very loosely. Like, do we need to create a sort of global, agency that is saying the house is on fire rather than it's, I don't know.
I think that,
but really fast, Lisa, not weeks ago, the US led a new proposition to fundamentally change the corporate tax globally. And that's being signed up to around the world. That will disrupt countries like Ireland, for example, who've really pushed on white collar jobs being in a bit of a tax haven. So I disagree that we're not going to see a fundamental shift in the next decade. It's starting to happen, and it's happening around us. I think what is not easy to do is to change the way that we build stuff. And that gives us some heartburn because of the billions of dollars that we've invested in today's infrastructure. And in order to shift into more of what Lisa has been describing, it will take an infrastructure change, which freaks us out a lot. Capital investments are not to be taken lightly. I will say I have talked to multiple air freight carriers on how they can make changes to become more carbon neutral. Very interesting in terms of changing routes and how to become more efficient. So the conversations are happening, maybe not specifically on reshoring, but the discussions on, we're backing ourselves into a corner and we're each playing a role here. How do we even start thinking about how we can get out of it? Those conversations are happening, albeit perhaps a bit quiet, because we're not entirely sure how to get out of it right now. And so my pulse on the market is that people are doing their homework to try to come up with what they can actually publicly sign up to without stubbing their toes in the coming years. But I challenge that these changes are a pretty big deal that we're starting to see happen on a global scale. Lisa, apologies for interrupting.
No worries. I was just going to add that one of the other big topics we haven't really touched upon is the reason Brian and I have REFASHIOND Ventures. There is such a lack of early stage supply chain capital being deployed. I mean, especially if you look at, say, my topic, fashion supply chain, it's a soon to be a $3 trillion global industry that touches 1 in every 6 employees on the planet is in some piece of the apparel supply chain, whether you're farming or retail or whatever. And so it's a massive industry that has made tons of pledges, and you have so much capital, but it's not being deployed where it needs to be. And so again, the industry is not making the investments themselves. And BCG and Fashion for Good came out with a white paper, I think it was January of 2020, right before the big COVID thing hit. So maybe it got buried under COVID, the world's on fire. But it was actually stating what I've been saying for years, that the fashion industry, for it to have a remote chance of hitting the sustainability goals they've set for themselves, they would need to be deploying $20 to $30 billion every year between 2020 and 2030 to have a remote chance of hitting their own sustainability goals. And I was asked in an interview once, well, how many billions are being deployed? I said, oh, no. It's maybe a couple of $100 million. And I can tell you all the funds that are deploying early stage fashion supply chain innovations. And it's scary, but that is also a massive opportunity. If you actually can identify and invest in the people that are doing the hard things, the hard, unsexy things of infrastructure that is required for all this innovation to sit on top of, because I think we get sort of dazzled by, ooh, AI. You don't need a better crystal ball if you have a demand chain. You can actually be responsive and reactive real time in market, rather than just, oh, I can see 18 months into the future. Ooh, it really isn't the solution you're looking for. So I challenge everyone to also think about where they are, what they're investing in. And if you're really looking at investing in the hard things, or if you're just, again, patting yourself on the back, giving yourself a shiny object that's going to deliver incremental change.
And sorry, I have to jump a little bit early, but I have a hard stop because I've got to go do some more interviews.
Well, thank you for joining us,
Only if
Christopher.
it's supply chain related.
A little bit. Some automation.
Chris, we really appreciate your thoughts and participation today. It was great, and really looking forward to digging into your book.
Yeah, really enjoyed speaking with all of you. Learned something from every one of you. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Christopher.
All right, bye-bye.
So should we maybe open it to some questions? I know there's been a lot going on in the chat.
Sure.
Okay, let me see. Anyone have a burning question? Maybe I can do a gallery view and see you raise your hand. Nobody raising their hand. Tax imbalances. Eric, talk amongst yourselves while I dig up a question.
Sure. Yeah. Peter, one of the questions that actually Lisa came up with that we never really got into because we got so deep on the this really fundamental issue, but let's sort of go back to the COVID situation and kind of the upheaval that we've seen. So you've been, I won't put a number, but suffice it to say it's in the decades that you've been covering this industry, the shipping industry. Was there anything that you learned out of these last 12 to 18 months that you didn't know before?
I saw that as one of the questions, and I don't know, nothing really came to mind. I mean, I just sort of was reflecting more than anything that a lot of what we're seeing right now is external and COVID related and not about the industry itself. So I think there was a question in there about ocean container carriers who I've covered for a long time. Well, what did I learn about them? And what I thought about was that this is really not, it's really not about them. They are in the spotlight now, whether they're being blamed for acting irresponsibly, profiteering, earning vast profits at the expense of their customers, even more wild accusations such as collusion, which are only allegations because they've never been proven. But the reality is that COVID is a one of the most significant historical events that has happened ever, and it wasn't not just container carriers, but the entire supply chain was just doing their thing, having their own little issues that they were dealing with, and then all of a sudden, bang, we were in a lockdown. And all of a sudden, no more spending on anything relating to travel or leisure, other than signing up for HBO Max or something, which is whatever it is, $10 a month versus going on a vacation for $5,000 or whatever the amount is, and that dried up. And all of a sudden now the amount of volume that is being shipped, because everybody's now got that home improvement project, is going through the roof. And then this dramatic shift to e-commerce. I don't know what it is. It's 5, 7, 8 years of growth in 1 year. Whatever that, you see various estimates of what that was. Who were the distribution centers ready for that? Was the infrastructure ready for that? Of course not, because all e-commerce moves through these distribution centers, with the exception of a fairly small percent that moves through sort of omni-channel, where you buy it online and you go to the store and pick it up. That's a relatively small percentage. Nobody was prepared for this. And every bit of the disruption that we're seeing right now is all about this, these sort of global external factors that are coming to bear upon an industry that is really just desperate to try to keep up, and then naturally, because they're the ones who are physically moving and creating the supply chain and making it happen, they end up sort of being on the receiving end of various and sundry complaints. But I think it's really more about the big picture and what's happened. And where does that go than the sort of transportation industry, which it's always been kind of reactive, has always been sort of behind on technology, has, been behind on customer service, behind on innovation. I would say, maybe that's not a very nice thing to say, but I would say that's my observation, because you're right, I've been covering this market for a while. So anyway, I don't know if that's at all answers your question, Eric, but there's a lot of focus, a lot of angst associated with ocean carriers. You look at the agricultural exporters in the United States have taken their complaints about exporters, all of which have been completely COVID related, straight to Congress, and are proposing a re-regulation of the industry on the basis that what they're seeing right now is going to happen before COVID and is going to continue after COVID, when in fact everything is COVID related. And if you're an optimist like I am, COVID will pass. I think it is passing as we speak, and we're going to move on to a post-COVID environment that's going to be more normalized.
Okay, I'm normally the optimist, Peter, and I'm going to say I disagree. I don't think we're going to have a big deep breath as a world where everyone stops for 3 to 6 months for us to build back better. I think this is our new baseline. And as Lisa was describing a disruption earlier, you just took the words out of her mouth to describe everything is about COVID. Now, this is our new baseline. There isn't going to be a going back to. Our eyes are open. We're bullwhipped. We're not going to just have 6 months to follow our little supply around the world and unbullwhip it slowly. I think this is now the new normal, and whatever we build back to, build forward to, I think the general population will say, oh, good, we're back to normal. And it'll be on the backs of hundreds of thousands of supply chain professionals who have built on top of and normalized the risk that we're on today. What that looks like, we're going to find out, because we've got a tremendous number of critical thinkers in this profession. But I actually challenge that. I don't think this is going to slow down. I don't think this is going to go backwards to anything. I don't think we're coming out of COVID. The percentage of the world population who have their first jobs is woefully low. And while that continues, then all of us continue to be at risk. We can use the Delta variant as a very small but disruptive example. So I see this as coming at least for the next year, perhaps year and a half. Maybe it's going to be longer, but I hope not.
Okay.
But if we're going to get anything done through the next 2 holiday seasons, the next 2 peak seasons, we're just going to have to build on top of this. I wish I could say, I think we can all sleep a little bit more in the near future, but unfortunately, I think this is the time that we're all going to prove why we got into the field, and to kind of build on top of whatever it is when we're in today, our new baseline, perhaps.
I think you just named your next book, Deborah, Bullwhipped.
Yeah.
And I couldn't agree more. I mean, not just COVID. People seem to think that it's just a COVID, non-COVID scenario that we're currently in, but the state of our current weather systems and fires and floods and hurricanes, tropical storms, and all of these things are creating unsustainable environments where we're going to see forced mass migrations. We're going to see entire regions that are going to be repopulated or depopulated. And all of this is now the new baseline, because we have broken things. And if we don't focus on fixing them, it's just going to keep getting worse and worse and worse. So I couldn't agree more. I think that we are now in this new constant state of change and disruption. And so if you don't bake into your system agility, resiliency, and redundancy, you're going to be at the mercy of the great bullwhip. I do have a question coming in from John. Question for panelists. Name your favorite current or past supply chain technology that has truly helped synchronize demand and supply in short to very long supply chain networks. Do this is context of global working capital. Inventories have grown past 20 to 30 years as percentage of GDP. I'm not quite sure I get that last sentence, but I'll start with the first part. Name your favorite current or past supply chain technology that has truly helped synchronize demand and supply in short to very long supply chain networks. Anyone? Deborah.
Give a quick example.
Yeah.
Yeah, go
Um,
ahead.
Peter.
I'm a fan of this company called NYSHEX, NYSHEX. It stands for New York Shipping Exchange. And so to show you how dysfunctional the ocean shipping world is, basically, I agree to ship with you, a container, and I make a booking. So a great comparison is with the airlines. If I make a booking and I don't show up for the flight, well, I'm on the hook for the amount, and that's my responsibility. That's not the way it's been in shipping. If I show up, if I make a booking, I may, the container might not show up, and you know what? I'm not going to pay you, and that's your problem to the ocean carrier. Well, the ocean carrier turns around and says, well, the opposite of that is, well, I'm not going to guarantee that I'm going to load. If you're not going to show up, not you, Peter specifically, but you, sort of the aggregate of customers, aren't going to show up against your bookings the way a passenger isn't going to show up against an airline. Well, I have no choice but to decline to load your cargo. I will overbook my ship, anticipating that a very large, and in the airlines, it's only very few people who show up, and maybe the airlines will overbook a little bit, but I mean, it's not going to be very much at all. But in the ocean world, I mean, you're talking 25-30% of the ship doesn't show up.
It's not unusual for there to be 4 bookings for the same container with different lines to ensure that you get.
Can you believe it? It's preposterous. It's medieval. It's antiquated. I mean, you could lose every. NYSHEX is saying, look, we're going to, through their sort of technology and process, they're going to build certainty into it, which means that when you transact through us, what's going to happen is that you're going to pay a penalty if you don't show up, and the carrier is going to pay a penalty if they don't load you. And they've actually started to create a system of trust between buyers and sellers in this market that sort of separates from the culture of the industry, which is that everything is loosey-goosey, and actually builds some real business relationships and transactions. And so and they're growing, and they've had a good pandemic. They're growing. They've moved from individual containers to full contracts. They're expanding into Europe. They had a new venture, a new funding round fairly recently, and it's looking pretty good for them, but for a good reason, because this is a real problem that they're solving.
How about you, Deborah? Any circular materials or systems that you are obsessed with?
Oh yeah, that was not the question I was going to answer. I was going to be a little tongue-in-cheek and represent the other side of supply chain and say TikTok. But seriously, the immense amount of money we've put into social media listening and algorithms to understand if there's a big soccer game or maybe football game in America, people aren't going to buy as many video games that weekend. And we start to understand consumer behavior, even into how many light switches will be turned on, what will the demand be on our sewer system, understanding we've all made ourselves into the Internet of Things willingly by putting a computer in our pockets, and we walk around with that information and it's beaming up constantly. So we know more now about what consumers are doing. Do we know more about what they actually want? I don't know. And our supply chains are so complex that our ability to respond to what we're seeing is pretty tough, because we have so many different versions of the same item. We actually don't really know where items are coming from, which makes any of the regulations that we had a sidebar in the chat about pretty impossible right now, because supply chains themselves don't really know, because they've become just so long and specialized. So a bit of a tongue in cheek, but this idea of knowing where people are and the relational impact then to what they use, I think will become quite important as we shift. I know it sounds crazy and it won't be 10 years, but maybe it'll be 15 or 20 into more of a sharing economy. Many of those folks who have been economicked out of their paychecks into, let's say, gig workers, and they're not making a lot of money, In the future, they'll be replaced then with fully autonomous cars. So we think about leveraging gig workers to do last mile delivery like Amazon is starting to do. We'll see that more with brands and not just your groceries or your favorite restaurant takeaway. Those will be delivered to you regardless of what you're wanting. And I suspect will also help us to deliver the spare parts we need to complete repairs through our supply chains. That then will alleviate the pressure we're putting on low wage, I'll call them gig workers, that we had talked about 45 minutes ago or so. So not really a full answer. And I don't have the answer to solving S&OP here today, but when I do, you'll be the first to hear about it. No, I'll stop there. That's it. That's the end of my answer.
I think it's so interesting that you touch upon the thing that really got me kind of pissed off, that nobody was really focusing on the supply chain. After founding the New York Fashion Tech Lab, I was talking to the C-suite of all these brands and retailers for the better part of a year behind closed doors. And I was like, stop with the shiny objects, folks. It doesn't matter how much more data you know about a consumer and how many more of a black dress you can give them. If you don't fix your back end, it's systems 101, folks. You cannot have an agile front end with a static back end. And so I think one of the things that maybe just first world countries have become obsessed with is this concept of search, that we have an infinite, we're drowning in optionality. And now it's a matter of finding the exact one that's just for me, because we're all special snowflakes. And I think instead of just having millions of possible permutations of a black dress, maybe we just offer the ability to produce the one of one that you will want, instead of having you be forced to choose between, 1,000 different deliveries from 1,000 different vendors of nuanced similarities in a black dress.
I agree, Lisa.
I know you feel the black
That's
dress
our
pain,
show.
Eric.
Yeah. I can empathize, or sympathize, not empathize. Right. I always forget which one is which, but well, I think we've reached our hour and a half.
Does anyone have any more burning questions? Feel free to unmute yourself. I see Daniel Stanton there. Hey, Daniel. A lot of our usual friends in the crowd. I personally have loved this conversation. I think I can talk to all of you for days. But as all good things must come to an end, we're going to be wrapping things up. And Eric, do you have any final parting words of wisdom?
No, this was a lot. I was sort of sitting, I realized half the time I was sitting there with my hand in front of my mouth, which does not make for good Zoom meeting posture, but it was great. I felt like I was at a really informative, seminar almost in the best possible way, interpretation of that word. So great thoughts. And Deborah, great to hear from you. And whether you believe it or not, you've got my juices flowing. So as I said at the beginning, I have resting cynical face. So if you can break through that, then you've really accomplished something. So.
Oh, that's perfect. Thank you. Thanks
and
for
it was great
having
to
me
hear
on
from
and
Chris.
having the space.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry, Deborah. Yeah, I was going to say it was great to hear from Chris too. He's really become pretty prominent and is a great face for our industry as well. So.
I'm looking forward to getting your book, Deborah, and digging into that next. It's going to be my Audible drive into the city.
Okay, it's not on Audible,
No.
but the idea is you should be able to 2 to 3 glasses of wine. You should be able to read the whole thing. So it's like an evening weekend. It'll go quick, and that is the purpose is meant to be like if we're sitting over drinks, which is the piece I really miss about not having in person. I love the ability to connect with people more rapidly and having forums like this become more inclusive. But the thing I really do miss is sitting down with people who understand me. I don't know if anybody really understands me, but we at least all understand supply chain and inventory in a great way. Daniel understands what I mean because he's laughing here, and to share a beverage. And so that's the thing I miss. So the book is written with the premise that let's sit down over a drink and talk about a really nerdy topic of circular supply chain.
I love that. And yes, I will meet you for drinks anytime, Deborah.
Great, perfect.
And Peter, any final parting words? Do you have a book that you're planning on writing?
No, I'm not planning to write a book. I'm just planning, I like doing what I'm doing, and I'm going to continue to do that as long as I can. I put my contact information on the, so if anybody would like to reach out to me, you're more than welcome, more than happy to continue this dialogue offline. Deborah, I think I'd love to talk with you more deeply about what you're doing and your perspective. That's really, really interesting what you were saying. So I might follow up with you if you would.
Please do. I look forward to it.
So,
Yes.
And then thanks to everybody else for participating. It's been really interesting.
Well, thank you, everyone. And if anyone is interested in joining us in our invite-only Slack channel, we have the Worldwide Supply Chain Federation on Slack, where you can have ongoing daily conversations with all of these fantastic people that are as enthusiastic and passionate about supply chains as we are. So hit me up. I put my email in the chat, and email me if you want an invite. With that, I will say goodbye and look forward to seeing you all next time. Thank you so much for joining us.
Everyone, thanks.
Bye. Have a good one.
Bye-bye now.